So here we have the agreement purchase of sale. It's also known as Form 100, and this is used in Ontario by realtors generally. This is what's used. It's basically used mostly for homes, so residential homes is generally when it's used for, and the purpose is basically to legally bind the buyer and seller together, as well as the terms of sales and defining those terms of sales. And it's also to protect both parties. So it's protecting them from financial, so for the buyers to protect it against some conditions that they would want on the purchase. So for example, financing approval or home inspections. And then it also protects the seller in that it's protecting the seller for time limits, deposits on terms, and for the deal to progress smoothly. So you start off with having the dated agreement of purchase of sale. So this is basically the date and when this was written. The buyer's full name. If it's multiple buyers, you'd put all their names in here. And then the sellers as well. So the sellers are generally found on the land registry as well. So you would put all that information here as well. Again, with that land registry, you would have the formal address of that property, the direction in which that property is facing and on which side of the street, and the street name itself. And then if it's in a municipality, a city, a town, or a county, this is where that would be in here. The frontage is basically the frontage of the property itself, the plot of land, as well as the depth. So these are estimates. They don't have to be exact, but it gives you want to be as exact as possible. And then the legally described info of that plot. The land description is generally found on the land registry as well. Now this is the purchase price. The purchase price is basically the price in which both parties agree on. Sometimes you'll see that this is used, and most often it's used if it's an offer is being put in play. And then you see it sort of crossed out and then resent with a new offer price, and then the dollar amount written down as well. So this can go back and forth a couple times. It can get a little messy, but as long as all have initialed or signed, then it is a bona fide purchase. Of course, I'm giving you the most common answer to that. There are sometimes edge cases, and I don't want to hinder that. This is just an opinion. If you are looking to get the nitty-gritty of this, I highly recommend speaking with a lawyer or a realtor if you don't have one already. The deposit is basically saying that once the agreement is made, there are sort of there's a couple options. The deposit can be given during the offer, upon the acceptance of this offer, or otherwise described in this agreement. So the most common one is upon acceptance, which basically means once the offer is accepted by both parties, then the depositor, the person that is giving the check to solidify this contract, has 24 hours to do so. And we're going to go through the amount of the deposit and then the number amount of this deposit. Then we have here the negotiable check payable to the deposit holder. Generally, this is put into the listing agreement or the seller's trust account, brokerage trust account. So this is generally the brokerage that's selling the property's trust account. It can also be put into the trust account of the seller's lawyer if that is the case as well. So what does trust actually mean? In trust, it basically means that it's not immediately given to the seller, but it's kept safely until a deal is either completed or terminated. So it's basically a common practice in which once it's in trust, if the deal is completed, then the funds are released. And there's always edge cases to that as well, but this is just to give you an idea of what the basic trust principles are. The purpose of the deposit is credited towards the purchase price. So for example, if it's $500,000, you put a purchase price and you put a deposit of $10,000. The net proceeds of just the purchase itself would be $490,000. Of course, we're taking into consideration that there's most likely going to be legal fees as well as land transfer taxes and things like that. So just be aware that I'm giving you a very, very broad scope overview of this, and the nitty-gritty would be done on each deal, and it would obviously be recommended to have it reviewed by your lawyer as well as your realtor. So the timing. The buyer must deliver the deposit within 24 hours of the agreement being accepted, if this is the option. So if it's upon acceptance, then basically the buyer has 24 hours upon acceptance. So for example, if it's 9 a.m. or if the offer is agreed upon 9 a.m. on Monday, by 9 a.m. on Tuesday, that check needs to be delivered to the accepting party. Generally, these trust accounts are in non-interest bearing accounts, so the brokerage is not making money in it, so they do not earn any interest, and therefore there's no it's just to ensure that there is no self-opportunistic or opportunistic sort of taking of those funds. So the key takeaways are that the buyer has to provide you with a deposit within 24 hours if you're the seller, and failure to submit those can result in a breach of agreement. For the seller, the deposit is not immediately yours. It is held in trust and put towards the price of the closing costs. So be aware that that's for the deposit. Let's go through the schedules. So Schedule A. So schedules are basically attachments to the agreement. So any additional documentation that would be included that are not on the the agreement purchase sale, also known as the APS. These schedules can be a legal part of the agreement, meaning anything started in them holds the same legal weight as this main contract. Now, the most common schedule is a Schedule A, and it often outlines additional terms, such as conditions or clauses, that modify this standard agreement. Some of the most common ones would be financing terms, to make sure that, for example, to confirm within 5 to 7 business days that the buyer is able to obtain financing. And if they're not able to obtain financing, then that allows the buyer to remove themselves from this purchase without any penalty. Another common one is also home inspection, and home inspection basically is it's most likely conducted by, depending on how it's shown in the clause, but it's basically done by a professional inspector, so a third party. And that way, if there is something that is that is sort of a super red flag, the buyer can also be let go of this offer or this purchase agreement without any penalty. It can also be a time in which, if there is something where they still want to purchase a home, but there are things that didn't show up that they were surprised with, they can usually request repairs or renegotiate on the price. Some other ones might be the sale of the buyer's property is conditional on this agreement. So, for example, allowing the buyer to sell their existing home before purchasing this one. This can be contingent on a successful sale on their home for this home to be completely committed to. And then this is, of course, to the discretion of the seller and buyer. So they both have to agree to this as well. Sometimes there's more deposit details and other custom clauses. For example, if there's a pool, or if there's something that's unique or a feature within that property, in which they can then add additional clauses to. So what's great about the Schedule A is that it can override standard agreements. So if there is a conflict between the clauses in the main agreement and the Schedule A, the terms in the Schedule A will most likely take precedence. I'm using the word most likely because, again, there are edge cases to everything. And it adds protection for both parties. So it allows for conditions such as financing and inspection for the buyer, and it doesn't force a buyer to deal somewhere where they can't afford it, without making sure that their I's are crossed and T's are crossed, and their I's are dotted But the purpose of that, again, is for both parties to be clear on what to expect. Let's move on to irrevocable. So basically the irrevocable is a way in which it sort of creates a time frame of to progress if there is if negotiation ensues. So for example, if an offer is made and there's an irrevocable, it allows the so once that buyer or seller gives an irrevocable, basically is saying that we are committed to this agreement for, so for example, it would be the buyer or the seller until a certain time frame, and if not accepted, this offer is null and void, and the deposit shall be returned to the buyer for in full without interest. So basically it's saying is it can go, the irrevocable can be used on both the seller and the buyer, and this can be done just basically saying, hey, you have 24 hours, 10 hours to review this. My offer stands until then, and if it doesn't get done within that time, then the deal is null and void. Again, let's say the buyer puts in an irrevocable of 12 noon today, then the buyer, let's say it's 9 a.m., the seller reviews it and says, and by 11 o'clock a.m., they're saying, okay, we're going to return it. They still have the option, of course, the seller would then cross out the buyer section, they would put the seller section and then give them let's say another certain amount of time, and then that's all dependent on the scenario. So this can be a benefit or a detriment depending how it's used, but it's more about making sure that both parties are moving the transaction along in good faith, and that's sort of the main thing here. Again, if the offer isn't accepted, usually it's the seller that doesn't accept the offer by the irrevocable day, then the offer becomes void, and then the buyer doesn't have to worry about being committed to this offer any longer. The completion date is basically the date in which this agreement is completed, when the actual transaction occurs. So let me see what I can say about that. Basically, this is the nuts and bolts of it, is that this is the transaction date, the date in which the lawyer hands over the keys, this the ownership changes hands, and now the possession is of the buyers and has been released by the seller. Notices: the seller hereby appoints at the listing brokerage as agent of the seller for the purpose of giving and receiving notice pursuant to this agreement, where a buyer's brokerage, buyer's brokerage, has entered into representation agreement with the buyer, and the buyer hereby appoints the buyer's brokerage as agent for the purpose of giving and receiving notices pursuant to this agreement. The brokerage shall not be appointed or authorized to be agent for either the buyer or the seller for the purpose of giving and receiving notices, where the brokerage represents both the seller and buyer, multiple representation, or where the buyer or seller is self-represented. Any notice relating hereto or provided for herein shall be in writing. In addition to any provisions contained herein and any schedule hereto, this counteroffer, any counteroffer, notice of acceptance thereof, or any notice to be given or received pursuant to this agreement, or any scheduled hereto, any of them documents shall be deemed given and received when delivered personally or hand delivered to the address for the service provided by the acknowledgement below, or when a fax number or email address is provided herein, when transmitted electronically to that fax number or email respectively, in which case the signatures of the parties shall be deemed original. So what does that basically mean? This clause is basically important for determining who can give and receive legal notices related to this agreement of purchase sale. So basically it's saying that the listing brokerage, the real estate brokerage representing the seller, is authorized to give and receive notices on behalf of the seller. If the buyer has a buyer brokerage, a buying representation, or a buyer with a buyer representative agreement, which we'll go through in another video, the buyer brokerage is authorized to give and receive notices to the buyer, on behalf of the buyer to the seller listing brokerage. In the case of multiple representation, which basically means that the agent is providing services for both the buyer and the seller, then in that regard, both the buyer and seller cannot act as an agent for giving and receiving notices. So they're basically providing, in this case, the buyer and seller must communicate directly or use their lawyers for notices. Self-represented parties, if either party is not using a brokerage, they must personally handle their own notices. How are notices mostly delivered? All notices must be in writing. Notices include offers, counteroffers, acceptances, anything that's basically within this transaction are considered to be delivered and received. Hand delivered is an option, sent by fax or email, and as of right now, the most common one now is electronic signatures are also considered valid, meaning that the document is sent via email and then treated with electronic signatures. Why does this clause matter? It ensures clear communication, so basically saying who is allowed and authorized to give and receive notices, and it specifies how notices must be sent. It prevents for any disputes over whether an offer or counteroffer has been or was properly delivered, and it confirms validity that electronic communication is allowed. And it protects for conflict of interest. So for example, if a brokerage is in multiple representations, then it ensures fairness within the same brokerage representing both parties. Now we have chattels included. So chattels are referred to movable personal property. This is not permanently attached to the home. So some examples of this would be laundry appliances like refrigerators, stoves, dishwashers, microwaves, laundry, washers and dryers, window coverings, curtains and blinds, light fixtures, if not permanently affixed. So another example is chandeliers, if specifically excluded, and outdoor equipment such as barbecue, lawnmowers, sheds. So anything that is movable is where chattels would be. The seller basically lists specific chattels they are including in the sale, or if there is nothing, then there would be no chattels automatically included. And chattels must be clearly written in this agreement if the buyer is expecting to receive them. A seller must transfer these chattels free of any liens or encumbrances. And this means that the seller cannot include rented items like a rented water heater, HVAC system without disclosing them. The buyer should check if appliances are fully paid for and not under any financing. So for example, if you do have a kitchen appliance that is being sold, the seller must be clear that must give that chattel free of any liens or encumbrances. This is just helping. The purpose of this clause is basically to prevent misunderstandings, avoid any last minute surprises, and to protect the buyer from any liens. So going on to fixtures excluded. So fixtures excluded. Generally, fixtures excluded is critical for clarifying which fixed items the seller is taking with them when they move. Unlike chattels, which are movable, fixtures are normally expected to stay with the property. What are some fixtures? Generally, they're light fixtures, built-in appliances, cabinetry or shelving, bathroom or vanities, ceiling fans, wall-mounted TVs, hardwired security systems, window coverings, outdoor items, so built-in barbecues. So if something is screwed into the property, it is considered a fixed item. And this is just allowing the seller to take those items with them. And so if it's not listed on the excluded, then it stays with the home. If the buyer expects the fixture to stay, it must not be listed as an excluded. So if the buyer expects the fixture to stay, then it must not be excluded. Some simple examples of this could be the thermostats, specifically like the Nest or the Ecobee smart thermostats. They want to be removed. It must be excluded in writing. So there's a good example of it. Another one would be a TV wall mount. So the TV wall mount is it's screwed in. The TV itself is movable. These are, again, every scenario is different, but this is an example. Another one would be a chandelier. This is probably a more common one, which is if you have a nice dining room chandelier and you want to remove it, then the seller would have to say within it, the dining room chandelier will be removed. And most likely, what I would also write in good faith is I would say it would be replaced with a standard light fixture before closing. So you would want to make sure that there's some sort of light fixture on there. Another one would be built-in bookshelves. That's another good one. But overall, you're assuming that it is items that are fixed that are being excluded from the sale. So that's just a really good, important one. The rental items. Rental items are most common water heater rentals, furnaces, and things of those natures. So this just basically goes through what items are in the home and are rented rather than being owned by the seller. So if an item is rented, it is not included in the purchase price. So you are not assuming that purchase price includes that water heater that's being rented. And the buyer may be required to assume that rental contract. So the most common ones are water heater, furnaces, air conditioners, water softeners, propane tanks, and sometimes alarm monitoring systems, as well as solar panels, sometimes under a lease agreement of some sort. Again, the seller must disclose all rented items in this section, or else it will be assumed that it has been assumable. The buyer must assume that the rental contract is assumable, and if it's already written in here as well. And the buyer may need to sign paperwork with the rental company before taking over that agreement. If the buyer does not want to assume that rental, then they have to negotiate that, whether it be a buyout option or a price adjustment to the seller to take into consideration that rental item. It protects so why is this important? Basically, it protects the buyer from unexpected costs. So then the buyer is fully aware of what the rental fees are after the purchase is made and the property is now transacted and closed. So it's just an additional rental fee that they should be aware of. And it ensures the seller has disclosed all rental agreements. So if the seller does not disclose that rental agreement, they may be on the hook for misleading the buyer because it wasn't represented. And then they're on the hook for those monthly fees or buyouts. Again, it goes back to avoiding last-minute surprises on closing day. Rental items that are not included in the purchase price must be disclosed, and buyers must assume rental contracts unless they negotiate a buyout. Sellers must list all rented equipment up front, and buyers should review all rental agreements carefully to check for super high fees for a rental unit, for a rental, hot water rental, or anything like that. Let's move on to HST. If the sale of the property, real property as described above, is subject to HST, then such tax shall be included or in addition to the purchase price. If the sale of the property is not included in this subject to HST, the seller agrees to certify on or before closing that the sale of property is not subject to HST. Any HST or shadows, if applicable, is not included in the purchase price. So HST clause is basically essential to determine who is responsible for paying HST. When does HST apply? So HST applies on new built homes purchased from a builder, substantially renovated homes, commercial properties, and vacant land in some cases, depending on its use. HST is not applicable to the following: if it's a resale home, so if you're buying a used residential property, then HST does not apply. Most farm properties do not have HST, and most personal use vacant land does not also have HST. Included in versus addition to. So included in basically means that the seller absorbs the tax that pays it out on the agreed upon purchase. So for example, if the purchase price is $500,000, including HST, the seller must ensure that the tax is paid within that amount. In addition to, the buyer is responsible for paying the HST. So if the price is $500,000 plus HST, the buyer must pay an additional $65,000. So this is not. It's very important to make sure that you're aware of these things. So the only time where the HST would most likely be used in a residential property would be in newly built homes or substantially renovated homes. And in that case, generally what occurs is the sale price would be reduced and then calculated to the agreed upon purchase price. So sometimes there's a little bit of changes that happen here depending on the builder. But if you're buying a used residential property, again, it's always assumed included in because there is no tax on. It's not applicable to residential properties that are your home. This does HST on chattels applies separately on chattels. So if it's a movable item like an appliance or furniture, this is again an edge case. The purchase price does not include HST on chattels unless otherwise stated, and the buyer or seller must negotiate separately on how HST for chattels will be handled. This is again going into minutia. I don't think that it's a very sort of edge case, and I would recommend speaking to a lawyer or your realtor depending on the transaction. So what's the purpose of this clause? It basically avoids unexpected tax liabilities, ensures compliance to the tax laws, and protects buyers in resale transactions. If HST does not apply, the seller must certify this, preventing any surprise tax bills later. Okay, let's go through title search. So the title search clause is basically critical in a real estate transaction because it protects the buyer by allowing time to verify the legal status of the property title. So what's registered as the title, and making sure that everything is correct throughout the title search. So the title search is generally done through the lawyers, and the title search is basically a legal review of the property's ownership and history to ensure that the seller has the legal right to sell that property. So that there's no outstanding liens or mortgages or encumbrances that could affect the buyer, and that there's no zoning violations, work orders, or legal disputes affecting this property, and that the current use of the property is legal and can continue with that sale. The requisition date. The requisition date is basically a deadline in which the buyer must complete the title search and raise any issues. This date is negotiable and is typically about 2 to 4 weeks before the closing date. If the buyer finds issues, they must notify the seller before this date. So usually it is 2 weeks before for residential, and then that allows the lawyer would then say, hey, I found a lien, an additional lien on the property that we were unaware of. What's going on here? Generally, the lawyers would be talking back and forth on that is how it would go. So before the requisition date, the buyer's lawyer would review the property titles, the zoning, any municipal regulations, outstanding work orders, so if there's an open permit, and any insurance eligibility, whether property can be insured against any fire. And what happens if the buyer finds a problem? So if there's any title defects, outstanding work orders, or zoning issues, they have to ask the seller to fix those issues before closing, negotiate a price or time, or cancel so basically negotiate the price or time allotment so that might push forward or push the transaction further outward, or cancel the agreement altogether. So this, if it's like a super serious issue that can't be resolved. If the buyer does not raise any objections before that requisition date, then the buyer's on the hook. The seller's obligations are to cooperate with the buyer to access any municipal records, and if requested, the seller must provide authorization to obtain work order details, building permit records, and municipal zoning confirmations. This clause matters again because it protects the buyer from legal and financial surprises, ensures the buyer is purchasing a property that is has a clean title, and gives the buyer time to investigate potential issues. It obligates the seller to provide necessary information, and it prevents any disputes at closing time. The most common one would be an open work order, where that I've sort of seen, which is the buyer notifies the seller that there's an open work order, and the seller must fix that issue before closing, or a price reduction would be included, or to remediate that, as the seller would be the one that would be taking on that work order. Another one is the property zoning does not allow for its current use, so it's something that's basically called non-conforming. The buyer purchases a duplex, assuming both units are rented out. The title search reveals that the zoning does not allow for duplexes, and it's made for single family. The buyer notifies the seller, and the seller is unable to resolve this issue. The buyer backs out of the deal before the requisition date. So that's an example of where that can happen. Understanding future use. The seller and buyer agree that there is no representation or warranty of any kind that the future intended use of this property by the buyer is or will be lawfully exempt, as may be specifically provided in this agreement. So the future use. The basic future use is the seller is not responsible for ensuring that the buyer can use this property in a certain way after the purchase. So if there is a non-conforming clause, if it's non-conforming, then the seller is basically saying, my hands are washed out of this because you, Mr. Seller or Mrs. Seller, should have done your due diligence on the title search. So the buyer must conduct their own due diligence. It's not up to the seller to provide them that unless requested, or if certain information is requested. The only exception if it is an agreement that is explicitly states that there is certain uses. So if there is a certain use, then this is where, and it's both been agreed upon, then that would be assumed to be true. Why this clause exists? Well, the buyer sometimes purchases properties with specific future use in mind. So for example, converting a single family home into a duplex, or having a property that had a residential property turn into a business, or add an additional building extension. But the zoning laws or municipal regulations prevent that use. This clause protects the seller from liability if the buyer later finds out that they cannot use this property as intended. So just because they intended to use it, the buyer didn't do the due diligence to see if it is possible to use it for. And that's why it's so vital to have that for the seller as well. So what the buyer should do is basically make sure that the zoning is correct, that they've confirmed with bylaw, municipal bylaw or wherever location their bylaws are, and review any, if it is a condominium or association, the homeowner association, make sure that the rules and regulations are okay, and verify that all building permits and land use restrictions are within reason for your intentions with that municipality. When the seller may provide a warranty for future use is, again, on the APS, where the seller warrants that the property may legally be used for a fourplex. So this would be specifically put in for guaranteed use in the APS, or else the seller would be held liable. Understanding title. So title is important because it allows for the buyer to receive clear ownership of the property without unexpected legal claims or encumbrances. So the seller must provide the buyer with a good marketable title, meaning the seller legally owns that property, the property is free of any financial or legal claims, and that the buyer will not face unexpected legal restrictions after closing. So basically that it's a clear title. Some exemptions that might exist are minor easements, so for example power lines or water pipes, telephone lines, and then municipal agreements as well, whether it be for utilities or easements is another one. So for example, easements for drainage, sewage, or cable lines for property use. Why is this clause important? It protects the buyer, ensures that no hidden financial claims or legal issues affect ownership, and it defines the seller's obligations. The seller must clear any unacceptable title defects before closing. It allows some exemptions, so the buyer must accept certain standard restrictions such as utility easements and municipal agreements. So what happens if there is a title issue? So if the buyer's lawyer finds a problem with the title, an unpaid lien, or an unexpected restriction, the buyer can request the seller to fix those issues before closing, negotiate on the price reduction or time frame, as well as walk away from the deal or cancel the deal. So that basically allows for an escape to exist. So the key takeaways are that the seller must provide a clear title, and that the buyer must accept certain legal restrictions. If there is a serious title issue, the buyer can request a fix, negotiate, or walk away from the deal. And a title search is done before closing is critical to ensure that no hidden problems exist. So next one is closing arrangements. Closing arrangements, it's handled by the buyer and seller's lawyer. Ontario uses an electronic land registry system to transfer properties. The exchange of funds and documents does not happen at the exact same time as the title transfer. So the lawyer holds closing funds and documents in trust until all conditions are met. Both parties agree to follow the document registration agreement set by the Law Society of Ontario, and lawyers handle this exchange of closing documents at an agreed upon location. So what happens during closing? Basically, the buyer's lawyer sends the funds. The buyer's lawyer transfers the purchase funds, usually via wire transfer or bank draft, to the seller's lawyer. The seller's lawyer registers the transfer, so the property ownership transfer is officially registered in the electronic land registry system. Then the seller's lawyer releases the keys and funds. Once the transfer is complete, the buyer receives the keys and the seller gets the sale of proceeds. The lawyer finalizes the closing documents, so they confirm that all documents, including mortgage, discharge, title transfer, and adjustments, have been properly handled. So those are both the lawyers on the buy side and the sell side. This basically just ensures that the transaction will close smoothly, and it protects the buyer and seller from fraud. The lawyers act as intermediaries and to ensure that no money or title is exchanged improperly. It confirms all closing conditions are met, and it follows the Ontario electronic registration laws. It eliminates paper-based errors and ensures fast and secure registration. Documents and discharge. The buyer cannot demand unnecessary title-related documents that the seller does not already have. So if the seller has an existing property survey or sketch, they must provide it upon request. If the seller has a mortgage or financial encumbrance on the property, it must be discharged, paid off before or shortly after closing. If the seller's mortgage discharge is not immediately available, the buyer must accept a legal commitment from the seller's lawyer that it will be discharged after closing. Why is this clause important? It prevents unnecessary delays. The buyer cannot demand title documents that the seller does not have, and it ensures that the seller clears any mortgages or loans before the buyer receives ownership. It also protects the buyer from assuming unwanted debts. If the seller has a mortgage, they must ensure that it has been discharged. It basically allows for flexibility. It allows for flexibility on discharging the mortgages. Some mortgages can take time to discharge, so the seller's lawyer can provide legal guarantee, basically saying that yes, once this transaction is completed, that the mortgage will be removed. What happens if the mortgage is not discharged immediately? Well, the seller's lawyer provides a written undertaking or a promise to clear that mortgage. The undertaking ensures that the buyer will receive a clear title and that the seller's lawyer will pay off the mortgage using closing funds. The mortgage will be officially removed from the title after closing. So basically it's saying that the lawyer is providing a promise that that mortgage will be removed. The buyer must accept these arrangements as long as the seller provides a mortgage statement and a payment direction to the bank. So basically this is saying that they do have a plan on paying, and it's on the lawyer's promise that it will happen once the transaction is closed and the funds are received from the buyer to the seller. How can the buyers and sellers protect themselves? Well, basically, they should have their lawyers confirm that the seller's mortgage was discharged and handled properly. The seller should ensure that the lawyer provides a clear mortgage discharge undertaking if the bank takes time to process it. If buyers should not assume they will receive additional title documents until the seller, buyers should not assume that they will receive additional title documents unless the seller already has them. If the seller should check with their bank in advance to confirm how long the mortgage discharge will take. Generally, it's done pretty quickly, but there are cases. This is just allowing for those cases to exist. Again, this is a very edge case scenario, but it's not enough for it to be not in here. So next step is inspections. So inspections basically mean that the buyer confirms that they have had a chance to inspect the property before signing the agreement. Once the offer is accepted, the deal is legally binding, and the buyer cannot back out due to issues that they should have discovered during an inspection. The buyer has the option to include a home inspection condition, but if they do not, they accept the property as is. So if the agreement does not include a home inspection condition found in Schedule A, then the buyer cannot demand an inspection later. So this is basically saying that once that buyer, if there is no condition on Schedule A saying I want an additional buying, I want a professional inspector to look at the home, this is basically saying that you viewing the home is considered an inspection, and you agreeing to put this purchase together is an And if the inspection clause is not within Schedule A, then it's assumed that you have inspected it fully, and it's basically an as-is purchase. This basically prevents the buyer from backing out due to inspection-related concerns, and it confirms that the buyer has had the option to include an inspection as an inspection condition, but chose not to. And it protects the seller from post-sale disputes about the property's condition. So it encourages the buyer to conduct due diligence before signing or having a condition of inspection within the Schedule A on the APS. Again, that conditional inspection can go a long way for some what-if scenarios. But if you want to buy an as-is property, this is just basically saying that you didn't put anything in Schedule A, and informally it's saying that you're not basically putting any conditions for additional inspections, so you viewing the property that you viewed was considered the inspection, and you're buying it as is. The key takeaways are that the buyer confirms that they had a chance to inspect the property before signing. If no inspection condition is included, the buyer accepts the property as is. If the inspection condition allows the buyer to cancel or negotiate if defects, an inspection condition allows, so if there is a conditional inspection put in on Schedule A, then the buyer allows for defects. It allows the opportunity for, if there are defects to be found, to cancel or renegotiate the deal. If a buyer should conduct inspections before making a firm offer to avoid any unexpected gotchas. Insurance. So what does this clause mean? Insurance is basically the seller is responsible for the property to be insured until closing. If damage occurs before the completion date, so before the date in which it closes up here, before, where'd it go? This completion date right here, it's assuming that before that time, the seller is fully responsible for the home. And if there's a substantial amount of damage that occurs, the buyer has two options. He or she can cancel the agreement and get the deposit back, or accept the insurance proceeds and proceed with the purchase. The seller does not transfer their existing insurance policy to the buyer. The buyer must obtain their own policy after closing. So if the buyer is assuming a mortgage or the seller is providing financing, the buyer must show proof of insurance before closing. Interesting fact as well is, if there is no mortgage on the property, insurance is not required, because generally the mortgage, whether it be a bank or a private lender, generally wants to have insurance on that property to ensure that mortgage is going to be paid out. So that's something that's sort of interesting to be aware of, is that if there is no mortgage on the property, there could be possibility that there is no insurance on the property as well. I'm not saying it's very, very rare, but it is a potentiality. Why is this clause important? Basically, it protects the buyer from financial loss if the property is damaged before taking ownership. So it ensures that the seller keeps the property insured until closing and in, existing functional order. It gives the buyer the choice to cancel or proceed with the purchase if major damages have occurred. This isn't an example of, a scratch on the wall. I don't want to get this house. It wouldn't include this. But if there was, the roof flew off, then that's a completely different story. Confirms that the buyer must obtain their own insurance upon taking ownership as well. And again, if it's a minor damage, so what happens if the property is damaged? If it's a minor damage like a broken window or a small leak, the seller must repair it before closing. And that's actually happened in a case where it was a broken window. We just agreed upon extending it after the fact. But another option would be renegotiate. So if it wasn't completed by the time of closing, then then there would have to be a review of the purchase price. Or you could cancel the agreement altogether and then deposit is given back. The most common, though, would be that I've seen is so far has been like a broken window and a small leak. Those are basically things in which the seller agrees to purchase it. Sometimes you can put a holdback as well, in which you make an amendment and you say, hey, this hasn't been taken care of, and we'll put a holdback until it is, and then you have a certain amount of time so that the property still transacts, but the holdback would be basically in trust on the buyer's lawyer to then be released once the window or leak is fixed. Sometimes, for example, a window can take 6 months or 6 to 10 weeks to be ordered. So if it's a fast transaction, it takes 6 weeks to 8 weeks to get the order arriving, and then you have the person to install. So sometimes it can happen. Just be aware of that. Another example would be like fire damages. If there's a fire, and again, the buyer must show proof of insurance if for the seller's mortgage, if the buyer is assuming the seller's mortgage. But for any mortgage lender, they would require proof of a home insurance before finalizing the loan. And again, if it's being assumed, if the seller's mortgage is being assumed, the buyer would have to provide a copy of the insurance policy to the seller. So basically, the key takeaways are that the seller is responsible for the property until closing. If substantial damages occur, the buyer can cancel or proceed with insurance proceeds. If the seller's insurance policy is not transferred to the buyer, the seller's insurance policy is not transferred to the buyer, and the buyer must provide proof of insurance if assuming a mortgage. Planning Act number 15. The Planning Act is basically saying that the sale is only valid if it complies to Ontario Planning Act, that this law regulates land divisions and ensures that properties are legally transferable. The seller must ensure that the property meets legal subdivision requirements. If consent or approval are needed, the seller must obtain those before closing. If the seller fails to obtain necessary approvals, the sale cannot be completed. The buyer would not receive legal title of the property. So basically what this is saying is, it happens mostly when you're seeing new builds, or an as-is property. I find that with as-is properties, power of sales, they do not want to, they sometimes cross this out because they don't want to be responsible for this. That being said, lawyers do provide title insurance to every purchase. So if there is a gotcha scenario, that's something that you still have as in your back pocket as well. So just be aware of that you do have a title insurance when a transaction occurs. You can opt out for, I don't even think it's basically it's common practice to always have title insurance. I've never seen someone deny it or request to deny it. But that's an example of if there is some gotchas, there might be a solution there. Again, you would have to talk to a lawyer or whatever that scenario is at that time. When does the Planning Act apply? The Planning Act basically restricts certain types of land transfers. If the property being sold is part of a larger parcel of land, and that was not properly divided. The seller previously severed another part of the land and is now selling another portion. The buyer wants to merge the property with an adjacent lot. So that's basically when this act applies. What happens if the seller needs Planning Act approval? The seller must apply for consent from the local municipality or governing body. The seller must pay for any costs associated with obtaining approval, and if the approval is not obtained before closing, the transaction cannot proceed. So an example of this would be sometimes an individual purchases one property and then they also purchase the adjoining property. Well, if they do that, those titles can merge into one, and if that were the case, then now they would have to resever that lot. I don't know the exact. I've never gone through it to the nitty gritty, but then again, you would go to a lawyer. I think it's still easier because it was an existing severed parcel. But there are solutions to prevent that as well. So if you are purchasing an adjoining property in like a residential property and you're buying the land beside it, if you have the identical individuals on title, those titles will automatically merge. Again, don't take my word for it. Talk to a lawyer, and things can change, but just be aware of that. And then talk to your lawyer how to prevent that from happening, I think is another good takeaway for that. Okay, transfer, where are we here? We are at document preparation, yes. Document preparations. So what does this clause mean? Basically, it's the seller must prepare the transfer or deed documents before closing, and the buyer is responsible for preparing the mortgage and financing documents before closing. If the buyer requests it, the seller must include a statement in the deed confirming compliance with the Planning Act. Why is this clause important? It basically is ensuring that clarity of who's responsible for which documents and the costs associated with it. So the key responsibilities: the seller is responsible for preparing the transfer, or I guess the seller's lawyer, maybe is a better way of putting it, prepares for the transfer or deed, the ownership and transfer documents. Who pays? The seller. And the seller also, if requested, includes a Planning Act compliance statement to the deed, and the seller would pay that. The buyer would basically pay for anything to do with preparing the mortgage or any charge documentation. So scenario one, the standard property transfer, the seller's lawyer would prepare the deed and send it to the buyer's lawyer. The buyer's lawyer would register the deed on closing day, and the sale is completed without any issues. The buyer would get a mortgage from the bank. The buyer's lawyer prepares the mortgage documentation and registers them along with the transfer, and the buyer pays for the mortgage documentation fee. The buyer asks the seller to confirm in the deed that the sale complies with the Planning Act, and the seller lawyer adds that required statement. The deed is then registered without any issues. So the key takeaways here are that the seller is responsible for preparing the deed, the buyer is responsible for the mortgage and the paperwork, and the seller, if requested, must confirm compliance with the Planning Act. And proper documentation preparation is the key to this whole thing. Residency. So what does this mean? Basically is that the seller must declare whether they are a Canadian resident or non-resident for tax purposes. If the seller is a Canadian resident, they must provide a statutory declaration, a legally binding statement. If the seller is a non-resident, Canadian tax law requires that the buyer to withhold a portion of the purchase price to cover potential capital gains obligations. So if the seller is a non-resident, then the buyer, the tax law requires that the buyer withhold a portion of the purchase price to cover potential capital gain taxes. If the seller provides a tax clearance certificate from the CRA, then the buyer does not need to withhold funds. Again, this is something that is usually taken care of by the lawyers. So if in that scenario, I would recommend speaking with your lawyer wholeheartedly on this. So what happens if the seller is a non-resident? Again, this is an edge case, but it still happens. Under Canadian law, when the non-resident sells Canadian property, as of right now, they must pay capital gains tax, and the buyer is legally responsible to ensure that this tax is withheld and remitted to the CRA. So it's the buyer's responsibility. Or, shall I say, the buyer's lawyer should be fully aware of this. If the seller is a non-resident and does not provide a tax clearance certificate, the buyer must withhold 25% to 50% of the sale price and remit it to the CRA. So if the seller does not provide a tax clearance certificate, that's where the non-resident, the buyer is legally responsible to withhold. If the seller provides, if this non-resident, non-Canadian resident seller provides clearance certificate, then the buyer does not have to withhold funds. So the key takeaway here is that the seller must declare their residency status for tax purposes, and if the seller is a non-resident, then the buyer may have to withhold 25 to 50% of the sale price for taxes. A CRA clearance certificate eliminates the need for these tax withholdings, and the buyer is responsible for ensuring proper tax payments if the seller is a non-resident. Adjustments. So adjustments are related to taxes, utilities, rent, and mortgage interest, and must be split between the buyer and the seller. So the seller is responsible for the costs up to, but not including, the day of closing. So they're up until the day of closing, but not including the day of closing, the seller is fully responsible. The buyer is responsible from the closing day forward. So if the closing day was January 1st, let's use another day because it's a holiday, January 2nd, then, or let's assume that's a Sunday. Let's just say, let's just use that anyways. Let's just say January 2nd, then the buyer is responsible for that day. So the insurance is already in play, and the taxes are already in play, and you're assuming those costs at that point. And that's how those final adjustments are made at closing, to ensure that neither party is overpaying or underpaying for taxes, utilities, etc., etc. A good example of that is with utilities. Usually I do it for my clients, and I would recommend it to anyone, is utilities. You would obviously have to notify, basically have a checklist of these are the things that the buyer and the seller have to take care of when changing addresses or moving their addresses, notifying utilities, and what day that closing date is. So what's included on it basically is property taxes, utility bills, and rent if there are tenants on the property. And then the mortgage interest if the buyer is assuming that the seller's mortgage. So if the buyer is assuming the seller's mortgage, then that's where that would be the case. I'll give you a brief example of that. So for example, if the property taxes are $3,600 a year, the seller has already paid for the full year, and the buyer then has to reimburse the seller for that portion of the year after closing. So for example, using April 1st as the date, then the buyer has already paid 9 months worth of taxes, so about $2,700. So then the the buyer already paid for $2,700 worth of taxes, so then they need to get reimbursed for those 9 months. Again, the best thing to do is always talk to, every scenario is different, and I would obviously talk to your lawyer about this as well. So another example is if the property taxes were $3,600 and the seller hasn't paid any of the property taxes, well, then the seller must pay their share up until the closing date. So the buyer pays the remainder after closing date. So that's something to be aware of as well. If the property has a rental tenant, and that's another example, then who's collecting the rent? And let's say it's on May 15th, and the seller would receive $1,000. Let's say it's a $2,000 rent. Then the seller has already collected May's rent, so the buyer would be entitled to the $1,000 at closing as well. Another one would be first and last month's rent. That's a little bit of a gotcha as well. Is within the tenant, the rental, generally in the agreement there would be a first and last month's rent. Well, then it assumes that the last month's rent would be transferable as well in a rental agreement. So again, this just takes into consideration certain costs and what the seller is responsible for in costs before closing and what the buyer is responsible for after closing, and adjustments for that to happen so that neither party is underpaying or overpaying. So we're at property assessments. Property assessments, basically, property values in Ontario are reassessed regularly under MPAC, also known as Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. And property taxes may increase or decrease, or I'm going to say increase more often than decrease after the sale, depending on the assessment. Neither the buyer nor the seller can make a legal claim against each other or their real estate agents if the property taxes change due to this reassessment. So basically, it's saying that the buyer or the seller have no legal claim to go against the real estate agent or each other for the purchase or sale of that home. There are some exceptions if there is unpaid property taxes before closing date, which still remain the seller's responsibility. So it prevents post-closing disputes over property tax changes, and it protects the seller from liability if taxes increased after the buyers take ownership. It ensures that the buyer understands that tax assessment may change, and it confirms that the seller must pay any unpaid property taxes before closing. So Ontario property values are assessed by MPAC. MPAC reassesses values generally every 4 years or sooner if there is a major change in the area or the property itself. And municipalities use these assessments to calculate property taxes. If MPAC reassesses the property and increases its value, the buyer's property taxes may also go up after closing. So that's something to be aware of. That's generally the trend, is that MPAC would reassess, and then property taxes are then a percentage of those assessments. Time limits. Let's bring this up a bit here. So time limits are basically saying that all deadlines in the contract must be followed exactly. If a deadline is missed, the contract could become null and void unless the affected party chooses to proceed. So if the party that is being affected chooses to proceed, then they have the right to do so. If time can only be extended or shortened if both parties agree, and lawyers of both the buyer and seller can sign time extensions if they have authorization. So what happens if a deadline is missed? If the buyer misses a key deadline, for example, a deposit payment, financing condition, the seller may cancel the deal and keep the deposit. If the seller fails to meet the deadline and provide clear title, the buyer may be able to walk away. And if both parties agree, deadlines can be changed with a simple amendment. Some examples are buyers missing deposit deadlines. So if a buyer required to pay $10,000 deposit within 24 hours, the buyer forgets to send the deposit on time, the seller can cancel the agreement and accept another offer. That being said, there is cases where sellers can be super aggressive and sue for that reason as well. A buyer needs more time for financing. So if a buyer, for example, put 5 days to secure financing and the lender needs another 2 days to review, the buyer can ask the seller for an extension in writing. And if the seller agrees with both parties signing, then you'd get that extension. If the seller can't provide a clear title on time, then the buyer's title, let's say it was April 15th, but the seller's lawyer needs more time to resolve an issue, then the seller requests an extension. If the buyer does not agree, then they can cancel the deal. And sometimes it's as simple as the closing dates. If the closing date on the contract says June 30th, but the seller's new home won't be ready until July 5th, then the seller asks the buyer for an extension. If the buyer does not agree, then the seller must close within June 30. Like if the buyer does not agree for that extension, then the seller must close on June 30th as originally agreed upon. This again is something that can be negotiated. Everything can be negotiated, and it's just a matter of finding that middle ground. This is just a way to ensure that both are aware of the deadlines and to take them seriously. Tenders. So what does this mean? Basically, on closing date, the buyer and seller or their lawyers must properly exchange funds and documents. Funds must be transferred in a secure and legally recognized form, such as a bank draft, a certified check, a wire transfer via the link system, it's called, large value transfer system, used for high value transactions. If one party properly tenders or offers payment or documents and the other party refuses, the first party is legally protected. They can prove that they've attempted to close in good faith the deal, then they are basically not liable for it not closing. It basically ensures that the structure and legal processes ensures a structured and legal process for closing, and it prevents last-minute disputes over payment methods. It protects either party if the other fails to close the transaction or if they're not acting in good faith. This establishes that a valid attempt to close or tender must be recognized by law. Again, if the party that is acting in good faith is again legally protected, and if the other tries to sue for damages or force for the proceeds of sales to go through the court, again that would not be the case. The seller may sue for damages if the buyer fails to tender, and the buyer may sue for damages if force the sale to proceed through courts if they're fulfilling their obligations. Some examples of this would be a buyer fails to tender funds on closing day, so they weren't able to provide a certified check. a seller refuses to close despite buyer tendering the payment. So basically the buyer's provided the payment, but the seller's sort of not wanting to close the property. The buyer can sue for specific performance. So basically forcing the buyer to close that property. The buyer pays in cash instead of a wire transfer. This is a big no-no, and this would show up as a non-recognized method to tender. So it would have to be within the legal means of transferring the funds. So tendering, or basically offering payment and documents, must be done correctly on closing day, and payments must be made through the secure and legal methods, which is a bank draft, certified check, or wire transfer. If one party properly tenders and the other refuses, the refusing party may be liable for breach of contract. Lawyers can handle the tendering process to ensure compliance and legal requirements. So this is an interesting one, which is the Family Law Act. The seller warrants that the seller's spousal consent is not necessary to this transaction under the provision of the Family Law Act, unless the spouse or seller has executed the consent herein after provided. So what does this basically mean is that if the property is being sold as a matrimonial home, Ontario's Family Law Act requires that both spouses consent to the sale. If only one spouse is listed as the owner, even if only one spouse is listed as the owner. So for example, if myself, David, had a matrimonial home and my partner, let's call her Maria, is not listed on that property, she would still be required to sign off on selling that property. So the seller must confirm whether spousal consent is needed. If spousal consent is required, the non-owner spouse must sign the agreement to confirm the approval. So if the spousal consent is required, so if there is a spouse and it is required, the non-owner spouse, so the individual, must also sign this agreement to confirm its approval. If the seller incorrectly claims that the consent is not needed, the sale could be challenged in court or become invalid. So it just gets really messy. The best option is to always act in good faith and be honest, is what it comes down to. So if it is, again, the matrimonial home, what does that mean? It basically means a married couple, it's their primary residence, and it's not an investment property or rental. Even if only one spouse is on title, both must agree on this sale if it is their matrimonial home. If a couple is separated but not divorced, spousal consent may still be required as well. So what happens if there's no spousal consent is missing? If the home is the matrimonial home but the spousal consent has not been obtained, the sale could be invalid. The non-signing spouse could challenge the transaction in court, and the buyer may not receive clear title. So this can cause issues later on. Again, real estate lawyers ensure that the correct spousal consents are obtained before closing, and again, this is something that the lawyers would have to review. And the purpose of it being in this is just so that everyone is clear, and specifically the lawyers, to review it. So sellers should confirm with the lawyers whether spousal consent is needed, and buyers should ensure that any required spousal consent is signed before closing. And again, real estate agents should also verify that sellers match marital status within listing a property. So it's always important that the real estate agent is aware of the marital status when listing a property. And lawyers should ensure that the Family Law Act requirements are met to prevent any legal issues later on. UFFI, so urea formaldehyde foam insulation. This clause is basically saying that the seller guarantees that they have not installed UFFI while owning a home, owning this home. The seller also states that, to their knowledge, UFFI has never been present in the home. This warranty survives closing, meaning that the buyer can take legal action if it turns out that UFFI was present and not disclosed. So if the sellers were aware of UFFI and not disclosing it, then that's an issue. If the property is part of a larger multi-unit building, for example, a condo or a duplex, this only applies to the unit being sold. Something about UFFI is it basically was done from what I don't take my word for it, do your own research, but my opinions are that it started in 1970s is when it first came out, and it sort of stopped right in the even at the 1980s. So it was a short amount of time, but it did have a big impact, at that time. Basically, it's a foam insulation that was used in the homes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 1970s. And it was, again, banned in Canada in the 1980s because when it dried, it released formaldehyde gas, which was believed to cause serious health issues like eye, nose, and throat irritation, respiratory problems, and long-term health issues is what they were saying. So it protects the buyer from hidden health hazards. It ensures full disclosure from the seller regarding UFFIs, and it allows a buyer to take legal action if UFFI have been present or were present and not disclosed. It also avoids financing and insurance issues. Some lenders and insurers may not cover properties with UFFI. So what happens if UFFI is found after closing? Well, since the warranty survives closing, the buyer can sue the seller for misrepresentation if UFFI was present and not disclosed. If the buyer discovers UFFI after closing, they may request compensation, seek legal action, or check their home insurance and financing policies, as companies may refuse coverage. So some examples would be that the seller confirms no UFFI, buyer later finds out. The seller states in the contract that there's never been UFFI in the home. The buyer conducts renovations after closing discovery, UFFI in the walls. The buyer can take legal action if they can prove that the seller knew that was UFFI. The buyer can ask for UFFI testing before purchases. The buyer could be concerned if UFFI existed and request an inspection before signing the agreement. Or you could put it as a condition. The seller agrees for an independent test, and the test confirms no UFFI is present, then the sale proceeds. The seller disclosed that UFFI was removed, so the seller sort of states that UFFI was previously present and professionally removed. The buyer agrees to proceed with the purchase because the disclosure prevents any legal issues later on. Legal, accounting, environmental advice. The parties acknowledge that any information provided by the brokerage is not legal, tax, or environmental advice. This is basically saying that as a realtor, your realtor is not liable for any information, acknowledges that basically seek legal advice, seek accounting advice, and environmental inspectors if needed. So you do need to go seek out, or the realtor should provide you with expert advice if needed. This is basically to ensure that the buyers and sellers understand that the real estate agents are not lawyers or accountants. They can provide you with opinions and insight, as well as help you seek expert advice to finalize the transaction, but the real estate agent is not legally liable if the buyer or seller claims they received incorrect information. It prevents disputes over tax obligations, zoning laws, and environmental hazards, or any other legal issues. All right, number 25, we're at consumer reports. The buyer here is hereby notified that a consumer report containing credit and or personal information may be referred to in connection with this transaction. Basically what this is saying is that the buyer's credit history and financial information may be accessed to review as part of the purchasing process. A consumer report or a credit check may be used by lenders or even the seller, if there's, in some cases, if it's a VTB, a vendor take back or something like that. So again, the most often is mortgage approval or seller financing, a vendor take back. Understanding agreements in writing. So going into, let me just see here. If there is a conflict or discrepancy between any provisions added to this agreement, including any schedule attached hereto, and any provision in the standard preset portion thereof, the added provision shall supersede the standard preset provision to the extent of such conflict or discrepancy. This agreement includes any schedule attached hereto shall constitute the entire agreement between buyer and seller. There is no representation, warranty, collateral, agreement, or condition which affects this agreement other than as expressed herein. For the purpose of this agreement, seller means vendor and buyer means purchaser. This agreement shall be read with all changes of gender or number required by the context. This agreement shall be read with all changes of gender or number required for the context. So what does this mean? Basically, if there's a conflict between the standard clause and any added provisions, example in the Schedule A, the added provisions take priority. Only what is written in the contract matters. Verbal agreements, emails, or informal promises are not legally binding, and this document, including attached schedules, is the entire agreement between the buyer and seller. No additional promises or side deals exist unless they are in writing and signed by both parties. Why is this clause important? Basically, it prevents any disputes over verbal agreements. It ensures that any special conditions added in this agreement take priority over the standard clauses, and it protects both the parties by making sure that everything is documented and legally binding. And it clarifies that there's no extra promises existing outside of what is written in this contract. So if there's a verbal agreement between, let's say, a hot tub that's not in the listing agreement, well, guess what? If it's not there on closing day, it's not legally binding because it wasn't put into the agreement. That's just one example of that. Let's go down to the next one, which is electronic signatures. Let's see if I have that here too. So electronic signatures, the parties hereto consent and agree to the use of electronic signatures pursuant to the Electronic Commerce Act 2000 as amended from time to time with respect to this agreement and any other documents respecting this transaction. So basically what this is allowing is it's confirming that electronic signatures are valid and that they are considered valid, meaning that any signed documents via email or fax will be treated as having an original signature. All right, number 28, the time and date clause. Any reference to a time and date in this agreement shall mean that the time and date where the property is located is where those, so for example, there's been a case where, let's say the property is here in Eastern Standard Time, which is -5 GMT, I think it is, or let's just say it's Eastern Standard Time, and the seller is in the West Coast, Vancouver. Well, if the property is in Eastern Standard Time, then that is the time and days that are valid through this agreement. So if there is an irrevocable, then the irrevocable is based on the property's location. All right, let's check out number 29, Successors and Assigns. Number 29, Successors and Assigns. There, the heirs, executors, administrators, successors, and assigns to the undersigned are bound by these terms herein. So basically, what does this mean? This means that the agreement applies not just to the buyer and seller, but also to their heirs, legal representatives, and anyone who takes over their rights. If the buyer or seller passes away before closing, the agreement remains legally binding and must be completed by their estate or legal representative. If a corporation is buying or selling the property, the agreement continues to be valid even if the company merges, restructures, or changes ownership. The buyer may be allowed to assign or transfer their purchase rights to another party unless the contract specifically forbids that assignment. So assignment may be allowed or transferred if need be. Why is this clause important? It ensures that the contract remains enforceable, even if the party dies or there are legal statuses change. It prevents buyers or sellers from escaping their obligations due to unexpected events, and it allows flexibility for buyers who may need to assign the contract to another person or entity. It protects corporate buyers and sellers by ensuring that the contract survives company mergers or ownership changes. So if a person passes away unexpectedly, let's say 2 weeks before closing, since the agreement is binding and on their heirs and executors, the seller's estate must be still complete the sale. So how do buyers and sellers protect themselves in this? Well, the buyer should check whether the agreement allows assignment before signing. The seller should understand that their estate must complete the sale if they do pass away before closing. And both parties should consult their lawyers if they're concerned about any corporate mergers or legal statuses. Understanding the signatures. So basically, you are signing here to say, I, the undersigned seller, agree to the above offer. I hereby irrevocably instruct my lawyer to pay directly to the brokerages with whom I have agreed to pay commission the unpaid balance of the commission together with applicable HST, harmonized sales tax, and any other taxes as may hereafter be applicable. If the proceeds of the sales of the sale prior to any payment to the undersigned or completion as advised by the brokerage to my lawyer. So basically what this is saying is that the seller confirms acceptance of the buyer's offer. The seller's lawyer is given an irrevocable instruction to pay the real estate commissions first. This means that the seller cannot later change their minds about paying the commissions, and that the commission amount is deducted from the sales of proceeds before the seller receives their net funds. The seller's lawyer must follow the brokerage's instructions regarding the exact commission amount, and the commission payment includes HST, which is mandatory for real estate transactions in Ontario. So this just basically protects the brokerage's right to receive their agreed upon commissions. It guarantees the real estate commissions are paid directly upon closing, preventing any disputes of unpaid fees, and ensures the seller's lawyer follow brokerage instructions regarding commission payments. It eliminates the risk of the seller refusing to pay the commissions after closing. Spousal consent. The undersigned spouse of the seller hereby consents to the disposition evidenced herein pursuant to the provisions of the Family Law Act, RSO 1990, and hereby agree to execute all necessary or incidental documents to give full force and effect to the sale evidenced herein. So what does this mean? Basically, if the property is the matrimonial home, both spouses must consent to the sale, even if only one spouse is the legal owner. The non-owner spouse must sign this clause to confirm that their agreement to sell the home. The spouse agrees to sign any required legal documents to complete the transaction, and this ensures that the sale cannot be challenged later on the grounds of missing spousal consent. So basically, this protects the non-owner spouse's legal right in a matrimonial home. It prevents the sale from being completed without both spouses' approval, and it ensures the buyer receives a valid and legally enforceable title. It complies with Ontario Family Law Act, which governs multiple matrimonial property rights. So this clause applies to the Family Law Act, which states that a family home cannot be sold without spousal consent, and even if only one spouse is on title, the other spouse must agree to the sale. If the seller is legally divorced and has sole ownership, spousal consent is not required. So what happens if spousal consent is missing? Well, if the seller falsely claims that spousal consent is not required, the sale can be legally challenged, and the non-signing spouse could take legal action to block the sale. If spousal consent was required but not obtained, the buyer may not receive a valid title to the property. So this can get messy, and as per usual, the best thing is to talk to a lawyer. Again, the key takeaways are: spousal consent is required for a matrimonial home. Without spousal consent, the sale can be legally challenged, and if the seller is divorced and has sole ownership, consent is not needed. So if the seller is legally divorced, this is the key, not separated but divorced. Buyer should confirm that spousal consent has been properly obtained to avoid any legal complications. This is a big one, so just make sure when you're speaking with your lawyer that all parties are on, and if there was a spouse, that they have this signed. Confirmation of acceptance. Notwithstanding anything contained herein to the contrary, I confirm this agreement with all changes, both typed and written, are finally accepted by all parties at 6 p.m. this 1st, or let's say 2nd of January 2029, let's say. And the seller, signature of seller or buyer. So basically this is the confirmation of acceptance, and this is done as the last person that agreed to all the terms and conditions. This is where, so if the price has both been agreed by whoever offered last, the last person that received these papers, so the person that's received these papers is then signing this to confirm that this is a done deal. Here you would put the information of the brokerages, so basically the listing brokerage. This is the brokerage itself, so ABC Realty would be here with their telephone number, and then the salesperson would be here as well. So this would be information about the brokerages, and then the cooperating brokerage or the buying brokerage would be down here. These are acknowledgements. So for example, let's say the seller was the one to confirm. The acknowledgement then would have to go to the buyer. So you would want both parties, but the buyer would then acknowledge to say, I acknowledge the receipt of my signed copy of this accepted agreement of purchase and sale, and I authorize the brokerage to forward a copy to my lawyer. So this is basically giving direction and explaining that both yes, I have received a copy, and yes, let's move forward and do what we said, which was give a copy to the lawyer so they can start proceeding with it as well. Commission trust agreement, as you can see, it's for office use only. It's basically saying that the listing brokerage or representing the seller brokerage acknowledges that the cooperating brokerage representing the buyer is entitled to the commissions agreed to in the MLS listing. Any commissions funds received in connection with the sale must be held in trust until properly distributed, and this creates a commission trust agreement, ensuring that the cooperating brokerage is protected under MLS rules. This agreement takes effect once the agreement of purchase sale is accepted, and that's basically about it. Why is this? It basically just protects against buyer brokerages. It ensures that the listing brokerage holds the commission funds in trust, and it follows MLS rules, and creates a legally binding commission trust agreement, preventing one brokerage from withholding funds from another. What do we got here next? Schedule A. Schedule A. Schedule A. Schedule A. So the purpose of Schedule A is basically allowing the buyer and seller to add custom terms and conditions beyond the standard agreement that we see here. It ensures clarity on key contractual obligations, and it gives buyers protections to include conditions such as financing approval, home inspections, and status certificates to review. It allows sellers to set specific requirements, for example, if there's a delayed closing, and it prevents disputes by ensuring all negotiated terms are documented and in writing. Some common examples within the Schedule A would be financing, another one would be a home inspection, and a status certificate if it's a condo. Another one would be like a sale of buyer's property conditions. So based on if the buyer needs to sell their property, then this property then is purchased, or any other repairs or renovations. This gives you a lot of flexibility, and each deal is different, but this gives you the ability to do that. And it can be larger than one page. And again, the buyer and the seller would initial this. And of course, this is an attachment that is on this complete agreement. So hopefully this has given you a summary in detail of what each clause is, clause by clause. Please be aware that the best thing to do is to talk to a lawyer. These are just my opinions, and I want to show, and also that there are revisions that are done. So you want to make sure that whatever the form is, it is also the most revised version. So there might be some changes before the time or after the time of this recording. And but the key sections to be aware of are the parties involved, the purchase price and the deposit, the chattels, the conditions of financing or home inspection in Schedule A, title and property assessments, the adjustments and closing details, commission payments, and spousal consent, and legal, tax, and environmental advice. So if you do need advice, it's best to outsource it to someone else. And then, of course, signatures. So basically the responsibilities of the seller: you must provide a clear and free title from any financial claims. You must disclose any legal restrictions affecting the property, and you must ensure that all rental items are properly transferred or bought out. And spousal consent is required if it's a matrimonial home. For closing and financial matters, you want to make sure that the deposits are held in trust and until everything is closed and completed. Property taxes and utility adjustments are made, and that's usually done through the lawyers. And then commissions are paid through the sales proceeds before the seller receives the funds. And again, this agreement is legally binding once signed, and verbal agreements are not enforceable. Hopefully this has been educational for you. Again, if you have any questions about buying or selling in London and area, feel free to give me a call or contact me on having as much thoroughness in whichever transaction that you would have. Good luck and have a happy transaction.